The railway system in Great Britain is the oldest in the world. The world's first locomotive-hauled public railway opened in 1825. Most of the railway track is managed by Network Rail, which in 2015 had a network of 15,760 kilometers of standard gauge lines, of which 5,272 kilometers were electrified. These lines range from single to quadruple track or more. In addition, some cities have separate rail-based mass transit systems. There are also several private railways which are primarily short tourist lines. The British railway network is connected with that of continental Europe by an undersea rail link. The Channel Tunnel opened in 1994. The United Kingdom is a member of the International Union of Railways. The UIC country code for United Kingdom is 70. The UK has the 18th largest railway network in the world. Despite many lines having closed in the 20th century, it remains one of the densest rail networks. It is one of the busiest railways in Europe, with 20% more train services than France, 60% more than Italy, and more than Spain, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Portugal and Norway combined, as well as representing more than 20% of all passenger journeys in Europe. In 2014, there were 1.65 billion journeys on the national rail network, making the British network the fifth most used in the world. Unlike a number of other countries, rail travel in the United Kingdom has enjoyed a renaissance in recent years, with passenger numbers reaching the highest ever level. This has coincided with the privatisation of British Rail, but the effect of this is disputed. The growth is partly attributed to a shift away from private motoring due to growing road congestion and increasing petrol prices, but also to the overall increase in travel due to affluence. However, passenger journeys have grown much more quickly than in comparable countries such as France and Germany. To cope with increasing passenger numbers, there is a large ongoing program of upgrades to the network, including Thames Link, Crossrail, electrification of lines, in-cab signalling, new intercity trains and a new high-speed line. Historical overview. The early railways were a patchwork of local lines operated by small private railway companies. Over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, these amalgamated or were bought by competitors until only a handful of larger companies remained. The entire network was brought under government control during the First World War, and a number of advantages of amalgamation and planning were revealed. However, the government resisted calls for the nationalization of the network. Instead, from the 1st of January 1923, almost all the remaining companies were grouped into the Big Four: the Great Western Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, the London, Midland and Scottish Railway and the Southern Railway Companies. The Big Four were joint-stock public companies, and they continued to run the railway system until the 31st of December 1947. The growth in road transport during the 1920s and 1930s greatly reduced revenue for the rail companies. Rail companies accused the government of favoring road haulage through the subsidized construction of roads. The railways entered a slow decline owing to a lack of investment and changes in transport policy and lifestyles. During the Second World War, the company's managements joined together, effectively forming one company. A maintenance backlog developed during the war, and the private sector only had 2 years to deal with this after the war ended. After 1945, for both practical and ideological reasons, the government decided to bring the rail service into the public sector. Nationalization. From the start of 1948, the Big Four were nationalized to form British Railways under the control of the the British Transport Commission. Although Bridge was a single entity, it was divided into 6 regional authorities in accordance with the existing areas of operation. Though there were few initial changes to the service, usage increased and the network became profitable. Regeneration of track and railway stations was completed by 1954. In the same year, changes to the British Transport Commission, including the privatisation of road haulage, ended the coordination of transport in Great Britain. Rail revenue fell and in 1955 the network again ceased to be profitable. The mid-1950s saw the rapid introduction of diesel and electric rolling stock, but the expected transfer back from road to rail did not occur and losses began to mount. The desire for profitability led to a major reduction in the network during the mid-1960s, with ICI manager Drive Richard Beeching tasked by the government under Ernest Marples with reorganizing the railways. Many branch lines were closed because they were deemed uneconomic, removing much feeder traffic from mainline passenger services. In the second Beeching report of 1965, only the major trunk routes were selected for large-scale investment, leading many to speculate that the rest of the network would eventually be closed. This was never implemented by BR. Passenger services experienced a renaissance with the introduction of the Intercity 125 trains in the 1970s. Passenger levels have fluctuated since then, increasing during periods of economic growth and falling during recessions. The 1980s saw severe cuts in government funding and above-inflation increases in fares, and the service became more cost-effective. In the early 1990s, the 5 geographical regions were replaced by a sectored organization, in which passenger services were organized into intercity network Southeastern Regional Railways sectors. In November 2014, The Independent alleged foreign governments are making hundreds of £millions a year running British public services, according to an independent investigation highlighting how privatisation is benefiting overseas, rather than UK, taxpayers. Privatisation. British rail operations were privatised during 1994 to 1997. Ownership of the track and infrastructure passed to Railtrack, whilst passenger operations were franchised to individual private sector operators and the goods services sold outright. The government said that privatisation would see an improvement in passenger services, and satisfaction has indeed gone up from 76% in 1999 to 83% in 2013, and the number of passengers not satisfied with their journey dropped from 10% to 6%. Since privatisation, passenger levels have more than doubled, and have surpassed the level in the late 1940s. Train fares cost 2.7% more than under British Rail in real terms on average. However, while the price of anytime and off-peak tickets has increased, the price of advance tickets has dramatically decreased in real terms. The average advance ticket in 1995 cost £9.14 compared to £5.17 in 2014. Rail subsidies have increased from £2.4 billion in 1992-93 to £3.5 billion in 2014-15, although subsidy per journey has fallen from £3.12 per journey to £2.13 per journey. However, this masks great regional variation. As in 2014-15, funding varied from £1.66 per passenger journey in England to £6.70 per journey in Scotland and £9.14 per journey in Wales. The public image of rail travel was severely damaged by a series of significant accidents after privatisation. These included the Hatfield accident, caused by a rail fragmenting due to the development of microscopic cracks. Following this, the rail infrastructure company Railtrack imposed over 1,200 emergency speed restrictions across its network and instigated an extremely costly, nationwide track replacement program. The consequent severe operational disruption to the national network and the company's spiraling costs set in motion a series of events which resulted in the collapse of the company and its replacement with Network Rail, a state-owned, not-for-profit company. According to the European Railway Agency, in 2013 Britain had the safest railways in Europe based on the number of train safety incidents. At the end of September 2003, the first part of High Speed 1, a high-speed link to the Channel Tunnel and onward to France and Belgium, was completed, significantly adding to the rail infrastructure of the country. The rest of the link, from North Kent to St Pancras railway station in London, opened in 2007. A major program of remedial work on the West Coast Main Line started in 1997 and finished in 2009, and was criticized for being over budget and behind schedule and reducing the specification from that originally proposed by Railtrack. In the 2010s, many upgrades are underway, such as Thames Link, Crossrail, the Northern Hub and electrification of the Great Western Main Line and the Midland Main Line. Planning for High Speed 2 is currently underway, with a projected completion date of 2026 for Phase 1 and 2033 for Phase 2. Passenger services. Passenger services in Great Britain are divided into regional franchises and run by private train operating companies. These companies bid for 7 to 8-year contracts to run individual franchises. Most contracts are awarded by the Department for Transport, with the exception of Merseyrail, where the franchise is awarded by Merseyside Passenger Transport Executive, and ScotRail, where the DfT awards on the advice of the Scottish Government. Initially, there were 25 franchises, but the number of different operating companies is smaller as some firms, including First Group and Stagecoach Group, run more than one franchise. In addition, some franchises have since been combined. There are also a number of local specialized rail services operated on an open access basis outside the franchise arrangements. Examples include Heathrow Express and Hull trains. In the 2014-15 operating year, franchised services provided 1,654 million journeys totaling 39.1 billion passenger miles of travel, an increase over 1994-5 of 117% in journeys and just over doubling the passenger miles. The passenger miles figure, after being flat from 1965 to 1995, surpassed the 1947 figure for the first time in 1998 and continues to rise steeply. The key index used to assess passenger train performance is the Public Performance Measure, which combines figures for punctuality and reliability. From a base of 90% of trains arriving on time in 1998, the measure dipped to 75% in mid-2001 due to stringent safety restrictions put in place after the Hatfield crash in October 2000. However, in June 2015 the ppm stood at 91.2% after a period of steady increases in the annual moving average since 2003 until around 2012, when the improvements leveled off. Train fares cost 2.7% more than under British Rail in real terms on average. For some years, Britain has been said to have the highest rail fares in Europe. with peak time and season tickets considerably higher than other countries, partly because rail subsidies in Europe are higher. However, they are also able to obtain some of the cheapest fares in Europe if they book in advance a travel at off-peak times. UK rail operators point out that rail fare increases have been at a substantially lower rate than petrol prices for private motoring. The difference in price has also been blamed on the fact that Britain has the most restrictive loading gauge in the world, which means that any trains must be significantly thinner and shorter than those used elsewhere. This means that British trains cannot be bought off the shelf and must be specially built to fit British standards. Average rolling stock age fell slightly from the third quarter of 2001 to 2 to the fourth quarter of 2013 to 4, from 20.7 years old to 19.4 years old. Although passengers rarely have cause to refer to either document, all travel is subject to the national rail conditions of carriage, and all tickets are valid subject to the rules set out in a number of so-called technical manuals, which are centrally produced for the network. Annual passenger numbers below the total number of passengers using heavy rail transport in Britain. The numbers are calculated from September to August. The following table is according to the Office of Rail and Road and includes open access operators, such as Grand Central and Hull trains. Railway stations. There are 2,552 passenger railway stations on the Network Rail network. This does not include the London Underground, nor other systems which are not part of the national network. Most date from the Victorian era, and a number are located either in or on the edge of town and city centres. Major stations lie for the most part in large cities, with the largest conurbations typically having more than one main station. London is a major hub of the network, with 12 main line termini forming a ring around central London. Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, Glasgow, Bristol and Reading are major interchanges for many cross-country journeys that do not involve London. However, some important railway junction stations lie in smaller cities and towns, for example York, Crewe and Ely. Some other places expanded into towns and cities because of the railway network. Swindon, for example, was little more than a village before the Great Western Railway chose to site its locomotive works there. In many instances, geography, politics or military considerations originally caused stations to be sited further from the towns they served until, with time, these issues could be overcome. High-speed rail. High-speed rail was first introduced in Great Britain in the 1970s by British Rail. BR had pursued two development projects in parallel: the development of a tilting train technology, the Advanced Passenger Train, and development of a conventional high-speed diesel train, the high-speed train. The APT project was abandoned, but the HSD design entered service as the British Rail classes 253, 254 and 255 trains. The prototype HSD, the British Rail Class 252, reached a world speed record for diesel trains of 143.2 miles per hour, while the main fleet entered service limited to a service speed of 125 miles per hour, and were introduced progressively on main lines across the country, with a rebranding of the services as the Intercity 125. With electrification of the East Coast Main Line, high-speed rail in Great Britain was augmented with the introduction of the British Rail Class 91, intended for passenger service at up to 140 miles per hour, and thus branded as the Intercity 225. The Class 91 units were designed for a maximum service speed of 140 miles per hour. and running at this speed was trialled with a flashing green signal aspect under the British signalling system. The trains were eventually limited to the same speed as the HST, to 125 miles per hour, with higher speeds deemed to require cab signalling, which as of 2010 was not in place on the normal British railway network. A final attempt by the nationalised British Rail at high-speed rail was the cancelled Intercity 250 project in the 1990s for the West Coast Main Line. Post-privatisation, a plan to upgrade the West Coast Main Line to speeds of up to 140 miles per hour with infrastructure improvements were finally abandoned, although the tilting train Class 390 Pendolino fleet designed for this maximum speed of service were still built and entered service in 2002, and operates limited to 125 miles per hour. Other routes in the UK were upgraded with trains capable of top speeds of up to 125 miles per hour, running with the introduction between 2000 and 2005 of Class 180 Adelante DMUs and a Bombardier Voyager family of Demus. High Speed 1. The first implementation of high-speed rail up to 186 miles per hour in regular passenger service in Great Britain was the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, when its first phase opened in 2003, linking the British end of the Channel Tunnel at Folkestone with Forcombe Junction in Kent. This is used by international-only passenger trains for the Eurostar service, using British Rail Class 373 trains. The line was later extended all the way into London St Pancras in 2007, after the building of the first of a new British Rail Class 395 train fleet for use partly on High Speed 1 and parts of the rest of the UK rail network. The first domestic high-speed running over 125 miles per hour began in December 2009, including a Special Olympic Javelin shuttle for the 2012 Olympics. These services are operated by the Southeastern franchise Intercity Express program for replacement of the domestic fleet of Intercity 125 and 225 trains on the existing national network. The Intercity Express program was announced in 2009. It was announced the preferred rolling stock option for this project was the Hitachi Super Express family of multiple units, and they are expected to enter service from 2017 on the Great Western Main Line and 2018 on the East Coast Main Line. The trains will be capable of a maximum speed of 140 miles per hour with minor modifications, with the necessary signalling modifications required of the network rail infrastructure in Britain likely to come from the phased rollout of the Europe-wide European Rail Traffic Management System. High Speed 2. Following several studies and consultations on high-speed rail, in 2009 the UK government formally announced the High Speed 2 project, establishing a company to produce a feasibility study to examine route options and financing for a new high-speed railway in the UK. This study began on the assumption that the route would be a new purpose-built high-speed line from London to the West Midlands, via London Heathrow, relieving traffic on the West Coast Main Line, and would use conventional high-speed rail technology as opposed to maglev. The rolling stock would be capable of travelling on the existing network rail infrastructure if required, and the route will intersect with the existing West Coast Main Line. A second phase of the project is planned to reach further north to Manchester, Sheffield and Leeds, as well as linking into the WCML, the Midland Main Line and the East Coast Main Line. High Speed 3. In June 2014, Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, Osborne proposed a high-speed rail link High-Speed 3 between Liverpool and Newcastle, Sheffield, Hull. The line would utilise the existing route between Liverpool and Newcastle, Hull, and a new route from to Sheffield will follow the same route to Manchester, Victoria, and then a new line from Victoria to Sheffield, with additional tunnels and other infrastructure. In August 2009, the speeds of the fastest trains operating in Great Britain capable of a top speed of over 125 miles per hour were as follows. In 2011, the fastest timetabled start-to-stop run by a UK domestic train service was the Hull Trains 730 King's Cross to Hull, which covered the 125.4 kilometres from Stevenage to Grantham in 42 minutes at an average speed of 179.1 kilometres per hour. This is operated by a Class 180 diesel unit running under the wires on this East Coast route. This was matched by several Leeds to London Class 91 operated East Coast trains if the 2-minute recovery allowance for this section is excluded. For the public timetable, local metro and other rail systems, a number of towns and cities have rapid transit systems. Heavy rail underground technology is used in the London and Glasgow underground systems. Light and heavy rail with underground sections in the city centre exist in Newcastle upon Tyne on the Tyne and Wear Metro, Liverpool on the Merseyrail system, and in the London Docklands. The light rail systems in Nottingham, Sheffield, Manchester, Croydon, Birmingham, Black Country and Edinburgh use a combination of street running in the city centres and, where available, reserved right-of-way former conventional rail lines in some suburbs. Blackpool has the one remaining traditional tram system. Monorails, heritage tramways, miniature railways and funiculars also exist in several places. In addition, there are a number of heritage standard and narrow gauge railways, and a few industrial railways and tramways. Some lines which appear to be heritage operations sometimes claim to be part of the public transport network. The Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway in Kent regularly transports school children. Most major cities have some form of commuter rail network. These include Belfast, Birmingham, Bristol, Cardiff, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Leeds, Liverpool, London, Manchester and Sheffield. Goods services. There are 4 main goods operating companies in the UK, the largest of which is DB Cargo UK. There are also several smaller independent operators including Mendeprail. Types of freight carried include intermodal, in essence containerized freight, and coal, metals, oil, and construction material. The beaching cuts, in contrast to passenger services, greatly modernized the goods sector, replacing inefficient wagons with containerized regional hubs. Freight services had been in steady decline since the 1930s, initially because of the loss of manufacturing and then road haulage's cost advantage in combination with higher wages. Since 1995, however, the amount of freight carried on the railways has increased sharply due to increased reliability and competition, as well as international services. The Department for Transport's Transport 10-year plan calls for an 80% increase in rail freight measured from a 2001 base. Statistics on freight are specified in terms of the weight of freight lifted, and the net ton kilometre, being freight weight multiplied by distance carried. 116.6 million tons of freight was lifted in the 2013-4 period, against 138 million tons in 1986-7, a decrease of 16%. However, a record 22.7 billion net ton kilometers of freight movement were recorded in 2013-4 against 16.6 billion in 1986-7, an increase of 38%. Coal makes up 36% of the total net ton-kilometre, though its share is declining. Rail freight has increased its market share since privatization from 7.4% in 1998 to 11.1% in 2013. Recent growth is partly due to more international services, including the Channel Tunnel and Port of Felixstowe, which is containerized. Nevertheless, network bottlenecks and insufficient investment in catering for 9 feet 6 inches high shipping containers currently restrict growth. A symbolic loss to the rail freight industry in Great Britain was the custom of the Royal Mail, which from 2004 discontinued use of its 49 train fleet, and switching to road haulage after a near 170-year preference for trains. Mail trains had long been part of the tradition of the railways in Great Britain, famously celebrated in the film Night Mail, for which W.H. Auden wrote the poem of the same name. Although Royal Mail suspended the mail train in January 2004, this decision was reversed in December of the same year, and Class 325s are now used on some routes including between London, Warrington and Scotland.